The first warning was silence. Dr. Elena Sorokina paused in the middle of recording meteorological data, her pencil hovering above the clipboard as she tilted her head. The constant background hum of the generator, a sound so persistent that the brain typically filtered it out, was gone. In its absence, she could hear the wind whistling through the station's metal struts, creating an eerie, hollow melody that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Mikhail," she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Generators down." No response came from the communications room where her colleagues should have been sending their weekly data packet to the mainland. Elena set down her clipboard on the weather monitoring station and pulled her parka tighter, adjusting the fur-lined hood against the perpetual draft that seemed to find its way through every seal and seam of Arctic Station Vostok. The station, a collection of interconnected modules raised on stilts above the ice, had been her home for the past 4 months. 4 months of darkness, interrupted only by the brief, ghostly twilight that passed for daytime during the Arctic winter. 4 researchers studying climate patterns, atmospheric anomalies, and ice core samples, all while the aurora borealis painted the sky in ethereal colors above them. Elena checked her watch. 14:27, still technically day, though the sky outside the small reinforced window showed only stars and a faint bluish glow along the horizon. The temperature display beside her workstation read 43 degrees Celsius external, 18 degrees Celsius internal. The heating system was failing without the generator. "Mikhail," she called again, louder this time, her breath visible even inside the station. She moved quickly through the narrow corridor that connected the research module to the communications room. The door was ajar, and she found Mikhail Kuznetsov hunched over the radio equipment, his expression tense beneath his unkempt beard. "Generators down," she said unnecessarily. "I noticed," he replied without looking up, his fingers working the dials with practiced precision. "No response from Arkhangelsk base. I was mid-transmission when everything cut out." He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting. "How long has the backup battery been running the essentials?" "Just a few minutes. Where are Pyotr and Anders?" "Supply inventory in the east module. I'll check the generator if you alert them." Elena nodded, feeling the first prickles of genuine concern. Station protocol dictated clear procedures for power failures, but something about the timing, during their weekly communication window, felt ominous. She found Pyotr Volkov and Anders Nilsson surrounded by open storage containers, methodically counting preserved food supplies. The Swedish glaciologist and the Russian engineer looked up as she entered. "Generators down," she said for the 3rd time. "Mikhail's checking it now." Anders straightened immediately, his tall frame nearly touching the low ceiling. "The backup battery only has 8 hours at minimum load. We need to conserve heat." Pyotr's face remained impassive, but his voice betrayed concern. "We were just discussing the supply situation. It's not good, Elena." Before she could respond, the station's alarm system, still operational on battery power, emitted 3 short bursts. The universal signal for personnel to gather in the common area. The common module was the heart of Station Vostok, serving as kitchen, dining area, and meeting space. It was also the best insulated section, with a small emergency stove that could burn fuel directly rather than relying on the generator. By the time Elena arrived with Anders and Pyotr, Mikhail was already there, his face grim beneath his fogged glasses. "The main generator's fuel line has ruptured," he announced without preamble. "Looks like metal fatigue from the extreme cold. I've shut off the flow to prevent further leakage, but we've lost about 70 liters of diesel." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she calculated what this meant. 70 liters, nearly a fifth of their remaining fuel supply. "Can we repair it?" Anders asked, already removing his gloves, ready to help. Mikhail shook his head. "Not with what we have. The line needs replacement, not patching." He paused. "But that's not our biggest problem. The communications array is completely down. No signal in or out. "The scheduled supply drop is still 3 weeks away," Pyotr said quietly, "if we can't confirm our status." Elena finished his thought. "They might assume everything's fine and stick to the schedule. Or worse," Anders added, "they might think the silence means we're already gone and delay sending anyone until spring." The 4 researchers looked at each other, the reality of their situation sinking in. The station had been designed with redundancies, but always with the assumption that help was just a radio call away. Now, with communications down and fuel supplies compromised, the margin for error had shrunk dramatically. Elena moved to the small window, wiping away the frost that had already begun to form on the inside of the glass. Outside, nothing but darkness and swirling snow was visible, with the occasional glimmer of starlight breaking through. The nearest human settlement was over 300 kilometers away across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. "We need to prioritize," she said finally, turning back to face her colleagues. "Heat, water, food, in that order." Anders nodded. "I'll reconfigure the backup generator to run only essential systems. We can seal off the peripheral modules to conserve heat." "I'll check our emergency beacon," Mikhail added. "It has its own power source and transmission system. If I can get it working, at least they'll know something's wrong." "Pyotr and I will finish the inventory," Elena decided. "We need to know exactly what we're working with." As they dispersed to their tasks, Elena felt a strange calm descend over her. The immediate shock had passed, replaced by a focused clarity. This wasn't her first crisis in the field, though it was certainly the most severe, and the protocols and procedures were clear. What troubled her was the timing. The generator failing precisely during their communication window seemed too coincidental. Back in the East Module, she helped Pyotr continue the inventory. The storage area felt noticeably colder now, and they worked with gloved hands, their breath forming clouds in the beam of their headlamps. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked quietly as they counted medical supplies. Pyotr's hands paused momentarily before continuing their methodical work. "Anders and I discovered a discrepancy in the fuel logs. According to the manifest, we should have had enough diesel to last until the spring transition. But even before today's leak." "We were already running low," Elena finished, the implications chilling her more than the dropping temperature. Either someone had miscalculated their fuel needs drastically, or "Someone's been using more than they've been reporting," Pyotr confirmed. "We've been trying to figure out who and why, but with the generator down and communications out." Elena nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. If this wasn't an accident, if someone at the station or back at headquarters had deliberately compromised their supplies, then their situation was even more precarious than it appeared. "Let's keep this between us for now," she decided, "until we know more." Pyotr agreed with a short nod. They continued the inventory in silence, the only sound the scratching of pencil on paper and the increasingly audible howl of the wind outside as the station's insulation battled the relentless cold. By the time they finished and returned to the common area, Anders had successfully reconfigured the backup generator and Mikhail had set up the emergency beacon. "The beacon's active," Mikhail reported, "but there's no way to know if the signal is reaching anyone." "The backup generator is running at minimum capacity," Anders added. "If we're careful, we can stretch the remaining fuel for maybe 3 weeks. But the temperature in the inhabited modules will hover just above freezing." Elena absorbed this information, mentally adjusting their survival timeline. "We'll need to consolidate, move all essential research and supplies to the core modules and seal off the rest. Set up sleeping quarters here in the common area where we can share body heat." The others nodded, the practicality of the suggestion overriding any concerns about privacy. In the Arctic, survival always trumped comfort. "What about the supply drop?" Pyotr asked. "If they stick to schedule, we have 3 weeks. If not." The question hung in the air, unanswered. Without communications, they had no way to confirm when or if help would arrive. "We prepare for the worst," Elena said finally. and hope for the best. As they began reorganizing the station for their new reality, Elena caught Anders watching her, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You seem remarkably calm," he observed quietly when the others were out of earshot. Elena offered a small, tight smile. "Panicking won't keep us warm." She paused, then added, "Besides, this isn't my first time being cut off. During my PhD research in Siberia, I spent 2 months alone when my satellite phone failed." "This is different," Anders said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're farther north, it's the dead of winter, and there are." He hesitated. "Complications?" Elena supplied. "Pyotr told me about the fuel discrepancy." Anders nodded, his expression grave. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's difficult to explain it as an accounting error." Before Elena could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the station, followed by a low, groaning sound that seemed to come from the very ice beneath them. Both researchers froze, listening intently. "Ice shift," Anders said after a moment. "The platform should compensate, but with the heating systems compromised." He didn't need to finish. The station had been designed to expand and contract with the ice, but those systems relied on consistent temperature regulation. Without proper heating, the metal would become brittle, the joints less flexible. "One more thing to monitor," Elena sighed, making a mental note to establish regular structural checks. As the day progressed into the perpetual night, the 4 researchers fell into a rhythm of necessary tasks, consolidating supplies, insulating the core modules, and establishing conservation protocols for everything from water to battery power. The temperature inside continued to drop, forcing them to don additional layers even indoors. By what their watches told them was evening, they gathered around the small emergency stove in the common area, its modest flame providing both light and a psychological comfort that outweighed its actual heat output. They ate a simple meal of reconstituted stew, savoring the warmth of the food as much as its sustenance. "We should establish a watch rotation," Mikhail suggested as they finished eating. "Someone should always be monitoring the emergency beacon and checking the generator." Elena nodded. 4-hour shifts. I'll take first watch." No one argued. Despite the crisis, or perhaps because of it, the chain of command remained clear. As station leader, Elena's decisions were final, even if they were arrived at collaboratively. As the others prepared their sleeping arrangements, thermal sleeping bags clustered close to the stove. Elena took her post at the communications console they'd relocated to the common area. Through the window, she could see the aurora beginning to dance across the sky, ripples of green and purple undulating against the star-filled blackness. The beauty of it struck her anew, even amidst their dire circumstances. For a moment, she allowed herself to be transported back to her childhood in Norilsk, watching the northern lights with her father, a meteorologist who had instilled in her a love for the Arctic's harsh majesty. "We respect the cold," he'd told her once, his breath visible in the frozen air. "We don't fear it. Fear makes you stupid. Respect keeps you alive." Elena drew that wisdom around her now like another layer of insulation. They would survive this, not by fighting against the Arctic's fundamental nature, but by working within its constraints, by respecting its power while exploiting its patterns. The beacon continued its silent plea into the darkness, its small indicator light blinking steadily. Elena watched it, finding its rhythm almost hypnotic. Blink, blink, blink. A heartbeat of technology in a wilderness of ice. Behind her, her colleagues' breathing gradually deepened into sleep, their bodies conserving energy for the challenges ahead. Elena remained vigilant, monitoring temperatures, checking fuel levels, listening to the sounds of the station as it settled into its new, power-conserving state. And all around them, unseen but ever present, the Arctic winter continued its patient siege, indifferent to their plight, waiting with the cold certainty of nature for any mistake, any failure of preparation or nerve. In the silence between the wind's gusts, Elena could almost hear it whispering, "I was here long before you came, and I will remain long after you are gone." The question that would determine their fate was deceptively simple. How long could they remain? The first morning after the power reduction dawned with deceptive beauty. Through the station's frost-rimmed windows, the Arctic landscape glowed in hues of pink and gold as the sun skimmed the horizon. Its brief daily appearance a reminder of how quickly darkness would return. Elena had dozed at the communications console, her neck stiff and shoulders aching. The room's temperature had dropped to 7 degrees overnight, uncomfortable but manageable. She checked the fuel gauge, 36% remaining. If their conservation measures worked as planned, they had approximately 18 days before total depletion. Behind her, Mikhail stirred first, his military training evident in how quickly he transitioned from sleep to full alertness. He immediately checked his watch. "Any contact?" he asked, his voice low to avoid waking the others. Elena shook her head. "Nothing. The beacon's still transmitting, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what silence meant. Mikhail nodded once, then began methodically rolling his sleeping bag. "We need to inventory everything: food, medical supplies, tools, anything that might help us stretch the fuel." "I've been thinking about that," Elena said, pulling out a notebook where she'd scribbled calculations during her night watch. "If we convert the storage bay into a single living space and seal off the rest of the station, we could reduce our heated area by almost 70%. Mikhail studied her notes. "It would be cramped, but warmer, and we'd use significantly less fuel." "What about lab equipment? Some of it can't handle freezing temperatures." "We prioritize. Essential monitoring equipment comes into the warm zone. Everything else." She made a dismissive gesture. Sasha awakened next, followed by Dmitri. As the group gathered around the small camp stove heating water for tea, Elena laid out her proposal. The discussion was brief. Survival logic trumped comfort. "We should start immediately," Dmitri said, already calculating the engineering challenges. "I can rig a better insulation system using materials from the maintenance shed." They divided tasks. Mikhail and Sasha would inventory supplies while Elena maintained communications watch. Dmitri would design their new living quarters. By midday, the supply situation had become clearer and more concerning. Their food stores were substantial, designed to last 6 months for the original team of 8. With 4 people, they had approximately 9 months of rations, assuming standard consumption. Water wasn't an immediate concern. They could melt snow indefinitely. Medical supplies were adequate for routine needs, but limited for any serious emergency. The real problem was psychological. As they worked, moving equipment and sealing unused rooms, Elena noticed the silence growing heavier. Without the constant background hum of the station's full systems, every creaking pipe and gust of wind against the exterior walls seemed amplified. "It's like the station itself is dying," Sasha murmured as they disconnected non-essential systems. A biologist specializing in Arctic ecosystems, she was the youngest of their group at 28. "I keep expecting to hear someone else moving around in the other sections." Elena understood. The absence of the others, Director Baranov, Dr. Kuznetsov, technicians Petrov and Volkov, was a presence in itself. They'd left 3 weeks earlier for the seasonal rotation, expecting to send replacements within days. Now the 4 remaining team members moved through spaces designed for twice their number, the emptiness a constant reminder of their isolation. By evening, they had transformed the storage bay into a surprisingly functional living space. Dmitri had engineered an impressive insulation system using emergency thermal blankets, foam padding, and even clothing to create a room within a room. The space measured roughly 5 meters by 5 meters, tight for 4 adults, but manageable. They'd relocated essential monitoring equipment, their sleeping gear, the communication system, and basic cooking equipment. Everything else had been shut down, unplugged, and in some cases carefully drained to prevent pipes from bursting in the freezing temperatures they would allow to permeate the rest of the station. "It's not pretty, but it'll work," Dmitri said, stepping back to survey their creation. At 45, the station engineer was the oldest of the group, with deep lines etched around his eyes from decades of squinting against snow glare. We should be able to maintain 10 degrees C in here with minimal fuel consumption. What about when we need to use the bathroom facilities? Sasha asked. I've left minimal heating in that section, just enough to keep pipes from freezing. It'll be cold, but functional. Dmitri smiled slightly. I suggest quick visits. They ate dinner huddled in their new quarters, reconstituted stew that tasted better than it had any right to, perhaps because of their accomplishment. The fuel gauge now read 34. 8%. Their conservation efforts were already showing results. Elena took the first communication shift after dinner, methodically cycling through all frequencies, sending out standardized distress calls, then listening intently for any response. The only answer was static, a harsh, empty sound that seemed to echo the vastness surrounding them. She was about to switch frequencies again when Mikhail touched her shoulder. You should rest, he said. I'll take over. I'm fine, she insisted, but even as she spoke, a wave of exhaustion hit her. She hadn't properly slept in over 30 hours. Elena! His voice softened. We need you functional. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. She nodded reluctantly and surrendered her position. As she prepared her sleeping bag, she watched Mikhail at the console, his posture military straight, movements precise. Before joining the research station as security chief, he'd served 15 years in special forces. Of all of them, he was perhaps best equipped for their situation. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, Elena caught him staring at the fuel gauge with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. The second day brought a snowstorm that shrieked around the station's exterior like a living thing. Winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour drove snow horizontally past their windows, reducing visibility to 0. The temperature outside plummeted to 43 degrees Celsius. Inside their insulated bubble, they maintained 12 hours, warmer than expected, a small victory that improved morale. They established a routine, 4-hour communication shifts, regular equipment checks, and twice daily temperature monitoring throughout the station. During her afternoon shift, Elena noticed something odd about the communication system. The signal strength indicator occasionally flickered, as if briefly receiving something before fading back to baseline. Dmitri, she called, could you look at this? He studied the equipment, making small adjustments. There's definitely something intermittent coming through, but it's too weak to capture. Could be atmospheric interference, or... He paused. Or what? Or someone's transmitting, but their signal isn't strong enough to reach us clearly. Hope and frustration surged simultaneously in Elena's chest. Can we boost our receiver somehow? Dmitri considered this. Maybe. I might be able to rig an amplification system using parts from the backup meteorological equipment. Not standard procedure, but... He shrugged. Do it, Mikhail said from across the room, where he'd been organizing their medical supplies. Standard procedure doesn't apply anymore. While Dmitri worked on the communication system, Sasha approached Elena with a notebook full of calculations. I've been analyzing our situation, she said quietly. With our current conservation measures, the fuel should last approximately 22 days. If we reduce the temperature another 2 degrees, we might stretch it to 28. 28 days, Elena repeated. Not nearly enough for the entire winter. There's something else, Sasha continued. I've been monitoring the weather patterns. This storm system is massive. Satellite data from yesterday shows it covering much of the region, if anyone's trying to reach us physically. She didn't need to finish. They all understood the implications. No helicopter or plane could navigate in these conditions. They were truly on their own. That night, as the storm reached its peak intensity, the station's exterior sensors recorded a temperature of 51 degrees with wind chill approaching 70 degrees. Inside their insulated space, they gathered close, listening to the wind's assault against their shelter. We should tell stories, Sasha suggested suddenly. From home, from before. Initially, the idea met with awkward silence. They were colleagues, not friends, their relationships professional rather than personal. But isolation has its own gravity, pulling people into new orbits around each other. Dmitri went first, describing his childhood in Arkhangelsk, where his father had captained an icebreaker. Sasha spoke of university days in St. Petersburg. Mikhail, surprisingly, shared a story about getting lost in the Ural Mountains during a training exercise and surviving 3 days alone before finding his way back. When Elena's turn came, she described the northern lights as seen from her hometown, how her father had explained them scientifically while her mother had told folk tales about spirits dancing in the sky. "My father said understanding nature's patterns was the key to survival," she concluded. "My mother said respecting its mystery was equally important." "And which do you believe?" Mikhail asked. Elena looked around at their makeshift shelter, built with technical knowledge but sustained by human resilience that defied simple explanation. "Both," she said softly. "I think we need both." Outside, the storm continued its siege, indifferent to their presence. But within their fragile bubble of warmth, something important had shifted. They were no longer just 4 individuals trapped by circumstance, but a unit forming its own ecosystem of interdependence. As they settled into sleep, Elena realized the station's silence no longer felt as oppressive. Their voices, their breathing, their presence had begun to fill the void, not eliminating the danger, but creating a counterweight to its psychological pressure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The fuel gauge now read 33, 2%. Dmitri's communications modifications remained untested. The storm showed no signs of abating. But for the first time since their isolation began, Elena felt something beyond mere determination. It wasn't exactly hope, too fragile a word for their circumstances, but rather a deep-rooted recognition of their collective capability. In the Arctic's unforgiving calculus, that might make all the difference. Dawn arrived as a mere theoretical concept. The digital clock on the wall showed 0730, but outside, darkness persisted with the same dense quality as midnight. Elena stared at the ceiling of her bunk, listening to the others' breathing patterns, Dmitri's soft snore, Sasha's rhythmic inhales, Mikhail's occasional muttering. She had slept fitfully, her mind cycling through calculations of fuel consumption rates and potential communication fixes. The temperature display read 44.7 outside. Inside, thanks to their reduced heating protocol, it hovered at 12°, cold enough that her breath formed small clouds, but warm enough to function. Fuel level, 32, 8%. The numbers had taken on an almost mystical significance. She swung her legs over the edge of the bunk, wincing as her feet touched the floor. Even through wool socks, the cold penetrated immediately. Elena had begun layering her clothing methodically, base layer of thermal underwear, followed by fleece pants and top, then the insulated station jumpsuit, and finally her personal down jacket while inside. Outside required full Arctic gear, which they now rationed in shifts to minimize the strain on the material. "Morning," Mikhail said, his voice startling her. He sat at the small communication station, headphones on, eyes bloodshot. "Nothing new, still static." Elena nodded, moving to the small electric kettle. They had implemented strict water conservation, melting snow collected from the entry vestibule rather than using their dwindling reserves. The process was tedious, but necessary. "How long have you been up?" she asked, measuring tea with precision. One bag would be used twice now. 3 hours. Thought I heard something around 0500. A break in the static. Couldn't isolate it. His frustration was evident in the tightness around his eyes. "Dmitri's frequency modulation idea might work, but we need parts." The station had once seemed adequately stocked. Now every inventory revealed new shortfalls. Elena had begun cataloging everything, down to counting individual screws and categorizing them by size. Today's agenda included disassembling non-essential equipment to salvage components. "We need to establish a routine," she said, handing Mikhail a half cup of tea. Conservation extended to everything now, to regular tasks, exercise protocols, communication attempts on schedule rather than constant monitoring. Military approach, he nodded. Structure increases survival odds. And psychological stability, she added. By 08:30, all four were awake. They gathered around the small table, their breath mingling in the cold air as Elena outlined her proposed daily schedule. 6 hours of technical work, communications repair, station maintenance, 2 hours of physical activity. We need to maintain muscle mass and circulation. 4 hours of rest and personal time, staggered. Food preparation and consumption, 3 scheduled times. Constant station monitoring will rotate between us. Sasha, the youngest, frowned. What about rescue preparations? Shouldn't we be setting up signals, preparing emergency evacuation scenarios? That's part of technical work, Elena explained, but we need to be realistic. The earliest potential extraction window, given standard protocols and our last reported position, is 3 weeks away. We need to focus on extending our survival window to match. Dmitri nodded, his mechanic's hands already fidgeting with a disassembled radio component. I've been thinking about the fuel. If we redirect heating to only 2 rooms, we could extend our supply by approximately 40%. We'll freeze, Sasha protested. Not if we insulate properly, Mikhail countered. We can create a thermal barrier using the emergency blankets, spare clothing, even papers and books as insulation between rooms. Elena felt a small surge of something like hope. This was what humans did, adapted, calculated, survived. We'll start today. Dmitri, you and I will work on communications. Mikhail and Sasha begin the insulation project. By midday, though the darkness outside remained absolute, progress was evident. Dmitri had created a makeshift signal amplifier using parts from the station's backup entertainment system. Elena had recalibrated the main antenna, a process that required 20 minutes outside in the brutal cold. The experience had been harrowing. Even through her full Arctic gear, the cold attacked with predatory intent. She had needed to remove her outer gloves to manipulate the fine control screws, exposing her fingers to temperatures that could cause frostbite in under 3 minutes. The wind had been merciless, finding every microscopic gap in her clothing and injecting its chill directly into her bones. But worst had been the darkness, not just absence of light, but a positive presence of blackness that seemed to press against her headlamp's beam, consuming it just meters ahead. The vastness of the Arctic night had awakened something primal in her, a recognition of human frailty that no amount of technical knowledge could fully dispel. When she had returned inside, Mikhail had immediately checked her fingers and face for frostbite, his inspection methodical but gentle. "You were out too long," he said, concern evident despite his professional tone. "The adjustment required precision," she replied, unable to stop the violent shivering that overtook her body as it registered the relative warmth inside. "We can't afford failed attempts." Now, 4 hours later, they gathered again for their first meal of the day, a carefully measured portion of reconstituted stew, supplemented with precisely 2 crackers each. Their food supplies were adequate for 2 months under normal circumstances, but Elena had already begun reducing portions by 15% to extend their window. "The insulation is nearly complete," Sasha reported, his academic demeanor giving way to practical pride. "We've converted the main lab and common area into our primary habitat. The sleeping quarters and secondary lab are now our cold zones." "Temperature differential is already noticeable," Mikhail added. "We've created a thermal lock system using the corridor. 2 doors, never open simultaneously." Elena nodded approval. "Fuel status?" Dmitri consulted his tablet. 32, 1%. Reduction rate has already improved from 0, 4% daily, to 0, 3%. With the new insulation, we might reach 0, 2%. Simple math, at 0, 2% daily consumption, they had approximately 160 days of fuel remaining. Their theoretical rescue window began in 21 days. The margin was substantial, but Elena had learned never to count on theoretical scenarios. "Communications?" she prompted. Modified transceiver is ready for testing, Dmitri said. But we need more power to boost the signal. I'm thinking we could temporarily redirect power from the cold zone's circuits. Do it, Elena decided. Sasha, help him with the electrical rerouting. Mikhail and I will transfer essential supplies to the warm zone. As they dispersed to their tasks, Elena found herself calculating not just survival odds, but psychological trajectories. Humans needed purpose, progress, hope. Their physical environment had contracted to just 2 rooms, but they needed to maintain the sense that their situation was improving, not deteriorating. The cold was becoming a character in their story, an antagonist with intelligence and purpose. As Elena and Mikhail transferred medical supplies from the now frigid infirmary, their breath hung in clouds so thick they sometimes obscured their vision. The thermometer showed tone in this section, but it felt more severe, as if the cold had density and weight. We should move the medical monitoring equipment next, Mikhail said, his military pragmatism evident in how efficiently he packed supplies. Blood pressure, oxygen levels, we need to track our physiological responses to these conditions. Elena nodded, then paused as she noticed something on his wrist, a thin strip of fabric tied in a precise knot. It hadn't been there yesterday. Following her gaze, Mikhail's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. From my daughter's hair ribbon, he explained quietly. Today is her birthday. She's 7. The simple statement landed with unexpected force. They had all mentioned families in passing, but had tacitly avoided dwelling on those connections. Survival required presence, not longing. You have a ritual? She asked, carefully packing vials of antibiotics. Each year I add a knot, he said. Started when I was deployed during her birth. Missed the first 3 birthdays. Promised myself never to miss another. His laugh was hollow. Failed at that. Elena felt the weight of his words, not just personal disappointment, but the larger truth they all faced. Outside their immediate struggle for survival existed entire lives temporarily suspended, people waiting without information, relationships paused mid-sentence. When we reestablish communications, she said, finding herself believing the when rather than if. Your daughter's birthday message will be our first transmission. Mikhail's eyes met hers, something unguarded in them for the first time since they'd been stranded. Her name is Natasha. She wants to be a cosmonaut. Then she has her father's courage, Elena replied. They worked in silence for several minutes, the cold numbing their fingers despite gloves. When they had filled their 3rd crate with supplies, Mikhail spoke again. What about you? Family waiting? Elena hesitated. Parents in Murmansk, sister in Moscow with her husband and son. She didn't mention the broken engagement 6 months earlier, the relationship that had fractured partly because of her dedication to this very research project. Some losses predated their current crisis. They'll be looking for you, Mikhail said with certainty. For all of us, she corrected. The lights flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. The power redirection was underway. They needed to finish quickly. By evening, though time had become increasingly arbitrary without natural light cues, the station had been transformed. The insulated warm zone maintained a relatively comfortable 15 degrees C while consuming significantly less fuel. Their living space had contracted dramatically, but the psychological benefit of not constantly shivering outweighed the confinement. Dmitri's communications modifications were in place, the power successfully redirected to boost their signal. At 20 down hours, they gathered around the transceiver for their first scheduled transmission attempt. Frequency modulation is set, Dmitri explained, his fingers dancing over the controls with practiced confidence. We're broadcasting on emergency channels plus 3 alternative frequencies I've calculated might penetrate the atmospheric interference. Elena watched the power meters as he activated the system. The lights dimmed noticeably as electricity flowed to the amplified transmission array. Arctic Research Station Vostok calling any receiving station, Dmitri spoke clearly into the microphone. Emergency situation, 4 personnel stranded, requesting immediate response. He repeated the message, then switched frequencies and repeated again. After cycling through all planned frequencies, he set the system to automatic repeat and turned to the others. Now we wait and listen. They established a rotation, one person monitoring communications at all times while others rested or worked. Elena took the first shift, sitting before the radio with headphones while the others prepared for sleep in their newly consolidated quarters. The static was hypnotic, white noise that seemed to contain patterns just beyond recognition. She found herself leaning forward, straining to separate meaningful signals from random atmospheric interference. Occasionally, she thought she heard fragments, a syllable, a tone that might be human, but nothing sustained. After 2 hours, Sasha relieved her. "Any contact?" She shook her head. "Possible fragments at 2117 and 2142, but nothing definitive." "Get some rest," he said, settling into the chair. "Tomorrow we'll try the directional antenna modification." Elena moved to her bunk in the warm zone, a narrow cot now positioned alongside 3 others in what had previously been the common area. Dmitri was already asleep, his breathing steady. Mikhail lay with eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "You should rest," she whispered. "Calculating," he replied softly. "If we reduce temperature another 2 degrees, we extend fuel by 12 more days. But below 10 degrees, condensation becomes a problem. Moisture in breath freezes on surfaces, creates secondary issues." "We'll find the balance," she assured him, though the variables seemed increasingly complex. Every solution created new challenges. As she settled under her layers of blankets, Elena found herself thinking not of technical problems, but of Mikhail's daughter, waiting for a father who couldn't reach her on her birthday. Of Sasha's university colleagues, Dmitri's aging mother in Arkhangelsk. Of her own family, perhaps already notified that the station had missed scheduled communications. The human variables were ultimately more complex than the technical ones. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of voices almost heard, messages almost received. In one dream, she stood outside in the Arctic darkness, watching colors dance across the sky, not the northern lights, but patterns of radio waves made visible, carrying words she couldn't quite grasp. She woke to Sasha shaking her shoulder urgently. "Elena, I heard something. A clear transmission, just for a moment." She was instantly alert, following him to the communication station. What did it say? His expression was both excited and frustrated. Just 3 words before it faded. "Vostok, confirm status." "Did you respond?" she asked, already reaching for the microphone. "Immediately, but the frequency was gone. Atmospheric window closed." He showed her the log he'd kept, the precise time and frequency noted. Elena felt a surge of contradictory emotions, hope that they'd been heard, frustration at the brevity of contact, but predominantly a renewed sense of purpose. "We need to focus on that frequency band," she said. "Dmitri can modify the antenna to maximize our chances when that window opens again." For the first time since their crisis began, they had confirmation they weren't shouting into absolute void. Someone, somewhere, had heard them, however briefly. As the others gathered, awakened by the commotion, Elena explained the development. Their reactions mirrored her own, cautious optimism tempered by the reality of their situation. "We should still proceed with all conservation measures," she concluded. "One brief contact doesn't guarantee immediate rescue." Dmitri nodded. "I'll begin antenna modifications at first light." The phrase struck them all as darkly humorous. There would be no first light in the conventional sense for weeks yet. But something had shifted in their collective psychology. The darkness outside remained absolute, but it no longer seemed to penetrate their shelter as completely. Fuel gauge, 31. 9%. Outside temperature, 49 degrees. Days since last external contact, 8. First confirmed reception of their signal, 6 hours ago. Elena updated their status log, the simple act of documentation providing its own form of structure and meaning. They were creating a record, not just of survival, but of adaptation and ingenuity in the face of circumstances designed to defeat them. "We should rest," she said finally. "Tomorrow we implement Phase 2 of our communication strategy." As they returned to their bunks, Elena noticed Mikhail adjusting the small ribbon on his wrist, adding another precise knot alongside the first. Not a birthday marker this time. Something else. A tally of days survived, perhaps. Or a promise of days to come. The human need to create meaning through patterns, she reflected, might be their most essential survival tool of all. Day 15 since communications failure. Fuel gauge, 29, 1%. Outside temperature, 52 degrees Celsius. Days since brief signal reception, 7. The small screwdriver slipped from Dmitri's fingers, clattering against the metal workbench. He tried to pick it up, but found his hands uncooperative, the fingers stiff and clumsy. He exhaled slowly, his breath forming a faint cloud even inside the station's main module. 16 degrees, Elena noted quietly from behind him. She didn't need to elaborate. They all knew the station's ambient temperature had been gradually decreasing as they rationed fuel more aggressively. 16 Celsius was their new normal, cold enough to see breath, cold enough that fine motor skills became compromised. "I need a break," Dmitri said, flexing his fingers. "The antenna modifications are nearly complete, but I can't feel the small components anymore." Elena nodded. "Take 30 minutes by the heater in the common area. We're running it for the scheduled warming period anyway." The station's new rhythm had emerged organically over the past week. 3 40-minute warming periods daily when the main heater would run at low capacity, bringing the common area to a relatively comfortable 24 degrees. The rest of the time they maintained what they now called baseline temperature, just enough heat to prevent pipes from freezing and humans from developing hypothermia. In the common area, Mikhail was leading Sasha through a series of vigorous exercises, jumping jacks, burpees, and rapid push-ups. Their exertion filled the room with the sound of heavy breathing and the faint smell of sweat. "Join us," Mikhail called to Dmitri, not breaking his rhythm. "Best way to generate heat is from within." Dmitri shook his head. "I need finger dexterity, not more sweat." Elena moved to the communications console, which remained powered at all times, despite their energy conservation protocols. The brief contact they'd established last week had not repeated, despite Dmitri's preliminary antenna adjustments. She checked the logs methodically, looking for any signal spikes that might have occurred during her sleep shift. Nothing. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not quite panic, but its precursor. The psychological effect of that brief contact had been profound, but its benefits were waning as days passed without follow-up. Hope, she had discovered, had a half-life. "Progress report," she announced, pulling everyone's attention. This, too, had become ritual, twice daily status updates that provided structure and purpose. Fuel at 29, 1%. At current consumption rate, we have approximately 37 days remaining before critical reserves. Dmitri is completing antenna modifications today. Food inventory remains adequate. Medical status? Sasha, still breathing heavily from exercise, stepped forward. All personnel showing early signs of vitamin D deficiency despite supplements. Recommendation to increase UV lamp exposure to 30 minutes per person daily. Also noting increased irritability and sleep disturbances consistent with seasonal affective disorder and chronic mild cold exposure. Elena nodded. Noted. We'll implement the UV recommendation immediately. She didn't mention what they all knew, that irritability was becoming their greatest internal threat. Yesterday, Mikhail and Dmitri had nearly come to blows over the proper way to insulate the station's north wall. The argument had seemed absurd in retrospect, but in the moment it had carried the weight of life or death. "I've been developing something," Mikhail said, retrieving a notebook from his bunk area. "A thermal mapping protocol for the station. If we accurately track heat loss points, we can target our insulation efforts more effectively." He spread the notebook on the table, revealing meticulous diagrams of the station's layout with temperature readings noted at various points. The east wall near the auxiliary generator loses nearly twice the heat of any other section, he explained. If we redirect some of the insulation materials from the storage module, which doesn't need to be kept as warm, we could reduce our overall heating requirements by approximately 7%. Elena studied the diagrams, impressed by the methodical approach. This is excellent work. Let's implement it immediately after the warming period ends. The timer beeped, signaling the end of their brief comfort. Elena moved to the environmental controls and reduced the heating output to baseline levels. The change was immediately perceptible, a subtle shift in air pressure followed by the gradual dissipation of warmth. They had learned to savor these transitions, to be mindful of the sensation of warmth leaving their surroundings. Adaptation, Elena had discovered, was as much about mental framing as physical endurance. "I'm returning to the antenna," Dmitri said, his fingers now pink and flexible after their time near the heater. As the others dispersed to their tasks, Elena remained at the communications console, running another diagnostic sequence. The repetitive task allowed her mind to wander. She found herself thinking about the concept of thermal equilibrium, how systems naturally exchanged heat until reaching balance. Their situation was a perverse version of this principle. They were engaged in a constant battle against equilibrium with the outside environment, an equilibrium that would kill them. The station's exterior camera feed showed nothing but darkness, occasionally interrupted by swirling snow when the exterior lights activated on their timer. The darkness had become a character in their daily existence, sometimes an adversary, sometimes a strange companion. A sudden bang from the storage module startled her from her thoughts. "Mikhail," she called out, rising from her station. No response. She moved quickly toward the storage area, the cold air in the corridor between modules biting at her exposed face. The storage module was kept at minimal heating, just above freezing, to conserve fuel. She found Mikhail standing motionless, staring at a large section of ceiling insulation that had collapsed onto the floor. Ice crystals glittered on the exposed metal of the ceiling, indicating moisture had penetrated and frozen. "How bad?" she asked quietly. "Bad," he replied, his voice flat. "Moisture got past the outer seal somehow. It's been accumulating and freezing between the layers. The weight pulled down the interior panel." Elena assessed the damage silently. This wasn't just about one panel, it represented a fundamental failure in their environmental protection system. If moisture was penetrating here, it could be happening elsewhere, invisible until catastrophic failure. "We need to inspect all ceiling sections immediately," she said. "Prioritize living quarters and critical equipment areas." Mikhail nodded, already pulling tools from his belt. "We'll need to reduce temperature further in non-essential areas to redirect heat here while we work. Otherwise, we'll be trying to repair this in gloves, and we'll miss smaller problems." The implication was clear. They would be even colder in their living spaces for the duration of the repairs. "Do what's necessary," Elena said. "I'll inform the others." As she turned to leave, Mikhail caught her arm. "Elena, we need to talk about the fuel situation realistically. These repairs will require additional heating. The 37-day projection is no longer accurate." She met his gaze steadily. "How much time does this cost us?" "At least 5 days, possibly more if we find similar issues elsewhere." 5 days, nearly a week of survival margin erased in a moment. "Understood," she said simply. "We'll adjust the conservation protocols accordingly." Back in the main module, she found Dmitri hunched over the communications equipment, his expression tense with concentration. Sasha was inventorying medical supplies nearby. "We have a situation," Elena announced, explaining the insulation failure and the necessary response. "So we'll be even colder," Sasha said, her voice carefully neutral. "For how long?" "At least 2 days for repairs, and we'll need to implement stricter heating protocols afterward." Dmitri didn't look up from his work. I need stable power for the communications equipment. Fluctuations could damage the modified components. You'll have it, Elena assured him, but we'll need to reduce heating further in sleeping quarters. We're already sleeping in thermal bags rated for extreme conditions, Sasha pointed out. How much colder can we make it and still function? Elena considered this question carefully. They were approaching the limits of human adaptation without specialized equipment. The thermal bags had been intended for field emergencies, not as primary sleeping arrangements. We'll rotate the UV lamps to the sleeping areas for 30 minutes before sleep shifts, she decided. It won't affect the ambient temperature much, but the radiant heat will warm the sleeping surfaces temporarily. As they discussed logistics, Elena noticed Dmitri had grown unusually still, his attention fixed on the communications display. "What is it?" she asked, moving to his side. "Signal spike," he said quietly, adjusting controls with deliberate precision. "Similar frequency band as before, but stronger. I'm trying to clean it up." The others gathered around the console, their earlier concerns temporarily forgotten. Static filled the small speaker, punctuated by unintelligible fragments that might have been voice or merely atmospheric interference. "Can you respond?" Elena asked. Dmitri nodded, switching to transmission mode. "Arctic Station Vostok responding to signal. Our situation is critical. Repeat, Arctic Station Vostok responding. Do you copy?" They waited, collective breath held, as Dmitri switched back to receiving mode. Nothing but static. He tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly. "This is Arctic Station Vostok. We are experiencing communications failure and critical fuel shortage. 5 personnel require evacuation. Do you copy?" The static cleared momentarily, and through the white noise came 3 clear words. "Signal received. Stand." Then nothing. "Stand by?" Sasha suggested. Were they telling us to stand by? "Or understand your situation," Mikhail offered. It could have been the middle of a longer message. Dmitri continued adjustments, but the frequency had gone dead. After several minutes of attempts, he sat back. "The window closed," he said. "But this is significant progress. The modified antenna is working. The signal was stronger, and we got actual words this time." Elena felt the familiar contradiction of emotions, the surge of hope mingled with the frustration of brevity. But Dmitri was right. This represented meaningful progress. "We continue with the repair work and conservation measures," she decided, "but we maintain constant monitoring of this frequency band. If they're trying to establish contact, we need to be ready." As they dispersed to their tasks, Elena updated their log. Day 15 since communications failure. Fuel gauge, 29. 1%, revised projection, 32 days remaining. Outside temperature, 52 degrees. Station temperature, 16 degrees baseline, with reduction to 14 degrees in living quarters, pending. Second confirmed signal reception, partially intelligible voice communication. Critical structural issue identified in storage module ceiling, repairs underway. She paused, then added a final note. Personnel status, adapting. The words seemed simultaneously inadequate and profound. They were adapting, physiologically, psychologically, socially. Adapting to cold that made fingers clumsy and thoughts slow. Adapting to the constant background anxiety of dwindling resources. Adapting to each other's fear-sharpened edges. As Elena moved to help with the insulation repairs, she caught sight of Mikhail adding another knot to the ribbon on his wrist. His private tally of days continued, marking time in a darkness that offered no natural delineation between one day and the next. Adaptation, she reflected, was its own form of survival skill, perhaps the most essential one of all. The human capacity to normalize the abnormal, to find equilibrium in extremity, might be what carried them through. If, that is, they could adapt faster than their resources dwindled. The groan came first, a deep, resonant complaint from within the station structure. Elena was halfway through her morning coffee when she felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled through the metal floor and into her bones. Mikhail looked up from his notebook, pencil hovering. "Did you?" The second sound was sharper, a decisive crack that echoed through the common area. Then silence, heavy and expectant. "Everyone stay where you are," Elena ordered, rising slowly. The temperature readout on the wall showed 57 degrees Celsius outside, even 13 degrees Celsius inside. They'd lowered the station temperature another degree yesterday after calculating their remaining fuel. She moved carefully across the floor, listening for any further sounds. The station had been designed to withstand thermal expansion and contraction, but they were pushing the structural limits with these temperatures. There, Dmitri pointed toward the northeastern corner of the ceiling, where a hairline fracture had appeared in the metal panel. As they watched, frost began to form along its edge, delicate crystals growing before their eyes. "Pressure differential," Sergei said quietly. "The cold is finding its way in." Elena assessed the situation with practiced calm, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Mikhail, get the emergency repair kit. Dmitri, help me clear this area. Sergei, check the thermal imaging camera. We need to see if there are other weak points." They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had trained together for years, though the heaviness in their movements betrayed their fatigue. 15 days of reduced calories and constant cold had taken its toll. While Mikhail retrieved the repair materials, Elena studied the fracture. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it represented something more ominous than just a structural weakness. The station was failing around them, succumbing to the relentless Arctic assault. "Temperatures dropping another half-degree in this section," Sergei reported, scanning the thermal imager across the walls. "And there's a second stress point forming here." He indicated another corner where the metal hadn't yet split, but showed the telltale thermal signature of imminent failure. Mikhail returned with the repair kit, epoxy resin, carbon fiber patches, and a heat gun that would draw precious power. Elena made the calculation instantly. "We use the resin without the heat gun," she decided. "It will cure more slowly, but we can't spare the energy." "It might not set properly in these temperatures," Dmitri warned. "Then we'll create a microclimate around it." Elena reached for the kit. "We'll use our body heat and insulate around the repair zone." The work was painstaking. While Mikhail and Dmitri prepared the carbon fiber patches, Elena and Sergei constructed a small tent-like structure around the fracture, using emergency blankets to trap warmth. They worked in gloves too thick for fine manipulation, removing them only for the most delicate tasks, their fingers quickly growing numb and clumsy in the cold. 3 minutes exposure, then warm your hands, Elena reminded them, demonstrating by tucking her own hands into her armpits after applying the first layer of resin. Arctic survival basics: never let any body part remain cold too long. Frostbite could develop in minutes at these temperatures. As they worked, the crack made another sound, a soft tick that sent a jolt of adrenaline through the team. "It's expanding," Mikhail murmured. "Work faster," Elena replied, not unkindly. She knew they were all moving as quickly as their cold-stiffened bodies would allow. The repair took nearly 2 hours, precious time and energy they couldn't afford to lose. When they finally stepped back, the patch held, but Elena knew it was a temporary solution at best. "We need to reinforce all the junction points," she said, studying the thermal map Sergei had created. "The entire northeastern quadrant is showing stress." "That will take days," Dmitri calculated, "and materials we don't have enough of." Elena nodded, the weight of command heavy on her shoulders. "We prioritize. Critical junctions first, then we improvise with what we have." "Chapm." They were interrupted by the crackle of the radio, the same frequency that had yielded their brief contact the day before. Dmitri lunged for it, adjusting the dials with careful precision. For 30 seconds, they heard nothing but static. Then, emerging from the white noise like a voice from the depths, "No AA, weather station. Position. Rescue attempt." The transmission faded back into static before they could respond. "They're looking for us," Mikhail said, his voice tight with a hope he seemed afraid to fully embrace. But they don't know our exact position, Sergei pointed out. The GPS transmitter went down with main communications. Elena moved to the maps spread across the table, old-fashioned paper charts they'd been using to track their position and the surrounding geography. If they're conducting a search pattern, they'll be methodical, she said, tracing potential routes with her finger. We need to boost our signal strength and maintain constant broadcast. That means more power, Dmitri said quietly. The unspoken calculation hung in the air between them. More power to the communications array meant less for heating. Less heating meant accelerated structural stress on the station. Accelerated stress meant more failures like the one they'd just repaired. Elena looked at the fuel gauge. 27. 3%. The repairs had consumed more energy than anticipated. We reduce temperature by another degree, she decided, and we rotate communications duty, one person broadcasting our coordinates continuously, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Another degree? Mikhail questioned. We're already at 13. The equipment will function to -5 if necessary, Elena finished. We've winterized everything critical. She didn't add what they all knew. Human bodies weren't designed for prolonged exposure to such temperatures, even with their cold weather gear. They were already seeing the effects: slowed cognition, reduced dexterity, constant shivering that burned calories they couldn't replace. We also need to consider relocating sleeping quarters, she continued. Consolidate to the southern modules where the structural integrity is better. That means abandoning the laboratory section, Sergei noted. Elena nodded. Science is secondary to survival now. The words hung heavy in the air. They were researchers, devoted to their work. The acknowledgement that their mission had fundamentally changed, from scientific inquiry to mere existence, marked a psychological threshold they hadn't yet crossed. I'll take first communications shift, Dmitri volunteered, moving toward the modified antenna setup. As the others dispersed to begin the process of relocating essential equipment and personal belongings, Elena returned to the thermal imaging camera. She methodically scanned each section of the station, documenting every stress point, every thermal leak, every potential failure. The image that emerged was sobering. The station was a constellation of vulnerabilities, each one a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. They could patch individual failures, but the systemic degradation was accelerating faster than they could respond. She was plotting repair priorities when Mikhail approached, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air. I've been calculating our remaining supplies, he said quietly, placing his notebook beside her. If we maintain current consumption rates and temperature reduction, we have 29 days of fuel remaining. Elena nodded, having reached similar conclusions. But, Mikhail continued, if we experience another major structural failure requiring repair. He tapped a different column of figures. As little as 21 days. Elena studied his calculations, noting the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Mikhail's work. And rescue? Mikhail hesitated. Best case if they received our coordinates clearly and mobilize immediately? 2 weeks. More realistically, given the weather patterns and our location? 3 to 4 weeks. The margins were razor thin. They both knew it. We haven't accounted for further temperature drops, Elena noted. February is historically the coldest month. I know. Mikhail's voice was flat. If it drops another 10 degrees outside. He didn't need to finish. They'd be forced to reduce interior temperature even further, accelerating both structural stress and their own physical deterioration. Elena closed the notebook. We focus on what we can control: structural reinforcement, communications, and conservation. Mikhail nodded, then hesitated. There's something else. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the knotted ribbon on his wrist, his private calendar. Today marks the first day of polar night. Elena had lost track of the natural cycles in their crisis. The sun, which had been appearing for progressively shorter periods each day, would now remain below the horizon for the next 3 months. They would work, eat, sleep, and struggle in perpetual darkness, broken only by the ghostly shimmer of auroras and the cold light of stars. "We should tell the others," she said. "I thought perhaps we shouldn't," Mikhail replied. "It's a psychological threshold, once crossed." Elena understood his concern. Polar night was notorious for its effects on mental health even under ideal conditions. In their current situation, it represented another enemy to fight. "No more secrets," she decided. "We face everything together, darkness included." Later, gathered in what would become their consolidated living space, Elena addressed the team. She outlined their situation without embellishment, the structural concerns, the communication progress, the fuel calculations, and the beginning of polar night. "We are entering the most challenging phase," she concluded, "but we've made contact. They know we're here. They're looking for us." "And if they don't find us in time?" Sergei asked, voicing the question they'd all been avoiding. Elena met his gaze steadily. "Then we continue adapting. We've already survived conditions we weren't prepared for. We'll keep doing so." As if in response to her words, the station creaked around them, not the sharp crack of structural failure, but the low, constant complaint of materials stressed beyond their design parameters. It had become the soundtrack to their days, a reminder of fragility. That night, huddled in her sleeping bag, now relocated to the southern module, Elena made her daily log entry by the dim light of a headlamp set to its lowest setting to conserve batteries. Day 16 since communications failure. Fuel gauge, 27. 3%, revised projection, 21-29 days remaining. Outside temperature, 57 degrees Celsius. Station temperature, 13 degrees Celsius, with reduction to 12 degrees Celsius pending. Structural integrity, first major failure repaired, multiple stress points identified. Communications, second partial reception of rescue coordination. First day of polar night. Personnel status, determined. She paused, pencil hovering over the paper, then added, "We are the fracture points now, too." In the darkness beyond her small circle of light, the Arctic pressed against the walls of their failing refuge, patient and absolute in its power. Elena listened to the breathing of her teammates, some already in the shallow sleep of the exhausted, others still awake and thinking their private thoughts. The station creaked again, a sound now so familiar it had become almost comforting in its predictability. Like them, the structure was adapting, finding new equilibriums under impossible pressures. She closed her journal and extinguished her light, adding her darkness to the greater darkness around them. In the morning, they would continue their work, repairing, reinforcing, broadcasting, conserving. The calculations might be against them, but numbers weren't the only factors in survival. As she drifted toward sleep, Elena's mind returned to the fragment of transmission they'd received. Rescue attempt. 2 words that meant they weren't alone in their struggle. Somewhere beyond the impenetrable night, others were fighting to reach them. For now, that knowledge would have to be enough. Day 87 since communications failure. Fuel gauge, 2. 1%, revised projection, 36, 48 hours remaining. Outside temperature, 43 degrees, warming trend continues. Station temperature, 7 degrees, fluctuating. Structural integrity, multiple temporary repairs holding, southwest corner abandoned. Communications, no further transmissions since day 62. Polar night, ended 12 days ago. Personnel status, surviving. Elena set down her pencil, the graphite worn to a nub. The journal entries had grown shorter as winter deepened, not from lack of events, but from the need to conserve energy, even the energy required to document their struggle. She flexed her fingers, watching how the tendons stood out beneath skin that had grown pale and thin over the months. The station's main room, once a hub of scientific activity and casual conversation, had transformed into something between a survival bunker and a hospital ward. They'd consolidated everything essential here, their remaining supplies, bedding, the functional equipment they hadn't cannibalized for parts. The air held the staleness of too many bodies in too small a space, mixed with the medicinal smell of antiseptic and the lingering trace of their last meal. a broth made from dehydrated vegetables and the last package of powdered soup base. Mikhail sat nearby, his broad frame now gaunt, methodically repairing a torn thermal glove with fishing line. The Russian engineer had lost 20 kilos, but none of his determination. The frostbite that had claimed the tip of his left ear and 2 toes had somehow hardened rather than broken him. "The fuel will not last until tomorrow night," he said without looking up from his work, his voice matter of fact. "Perhaps morning, if we are fortunate." Elena nodded. They'd long since abandoned pretense or false hope among themselves. "The temperature's rising. We might manage." "Might," he agreed, tying off a knot with practiced efficiency. 7 degrees is not so bad. We have survived worse." They had, indeed. The week when the northeast section had failed completely, temperatures inside had plummeted to 15 degrees 6 before they'd managed to seal off the breach. They'd huddled together in a nest of every blanket and piece of clothing they possessed, taking turns going out to make repairs while others generated body heat for the returning worker to absorb. Javier had nearly died that week. The Spanish biologist lay now on his makeshift bed, reading by the weak sunlight that filtered through the reinforced window. His pneumonia had finally responded to their dwindling antibiotics, but he remained the weakest among them. His breathing still carried a slight wheeze that everyone pretended not to notice. "How's the signal work coming?" Elena asked, looking toward the far corner where Amara hunched over the communications equipment. The Kenyan communications specialist didn't turn around. "Still nothing. I've tried every frequency, every pattern." Her voice carried the flatness of prolonged disappointment. "Either no one's listening, or we can't reach them." "Or they've given up looking," Javier said quietly, turning a page in his book. No one contradicted him. The possibility had been growing in all their minds since their last partial reception nearly a month ago. A fragmented transmission that had included what sounded like "conditions prevent" and "reassessment of viability." "They haven't given up," Amara said after a moment, her hands still moving methodically across the equipment. "The satellite passes should begin again in 3 hours. I'll try the new configuration then." Elena nodded, though she knew the chances were vanishingly small. They'd been sending distress signals for months, with only 3 partial responses to show for it. The modifications Amara had made to their equipment were clever but increasingly desperate. Repurposing parts never meant for communications, amplifying signals at the cost of clarity, burning through their remaining power reserves for brief windows of transmission. The light coming through the window shifted suddenly, dimming as clouds passed over the sun. The brief polar day would end soon, plunging them back into the long twilight that now constituted their night. Elena found herself craving the full darkness of deep winter. At least then, the distinction between day and night had been clear. "I'm going to check the perimeter," she announced, pushing herself to her feet. Her body protested the movement, joints stiff from cold and inactivity. At 43, she was the oldest of the survivors, and her body reminded her of this fact with increasing frequency. "Take the rifle," Mikhail said, nodding toward the corner where their last functioning weapon leaned against the wall. The bear tracks yesterday were fresh. Elena hesitated, then picked up the rifle, checking the chamber with hands that remembered the procedure even as her mind rejected the necessity of it. She'd never fired a gun before this expedition. Now she'd killed 2 polar bears, one that had broken into their storage shed in the desperate days of early winter, and another that had stalked Javier during a supply retrieval from the abandoned eastern module. The meat had kept them alive for weeks. The guilt still visited her dreams. Outside, the air hit her lungs like liquid fire, despite being 20 degrees warmer than the depths of winter. Elena pulled her scarf tighter across her face and began her circuit of the station's perimeter, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. The vastness of the Arctic landscape still humbled her, an endless expanse of white and blue that seemed to exist outside of human scale or comprehension. The station itself was barely recognizable from what it had been when they'd arrived 11 months ago. The proud research facility, designed to withstand the harshest Arctic conditions for years of continuous operation, now resembled a partially collapsed hive. Modules abandoned and sealed off, makeshift repairs visible as dark patches against the white exterior, ventilation systems jury-rigged with parts salvaged from their vehicles. As she rounded the eastern side, Elena noticed something she hadn't seen in months. A thin trickle of water running from one of the drainage outlets, freezing again a few meters from the structure. The spring thaw was beginning earlier than their records had predicted. In their situation, even this small mercy felt significant. She completed her circuit and paused at the entrance, looking back at the horizon. The clouds were breaking up, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through and illuminate sections of the ice field. In one of these golden spots, something moved. Elena froze, raising the rifle instinctively before her mind processed what her eyes were seeing. Not a bear. Something mechanical, moving with purpose across the ice. Her heart began to pound as she strained to see through the shifting light. The shape resolved itself gradually, a snowmobile, then another behind it. And behind them, something larger, a tracked vehicle of some kind, moving slowly but steadily toward the station. For a moment, Elena couldn't move, couldn't breathe. They'd imagined this scenario so many times, played it out in conversations during the darkest days, that the reality of it seemed impossible to process. She turned and stumbled back inside, the door banging open with a force that startled everyone in the room. "Someone's coming," she managed, her voice cracking. "Vehicles? 3, maybe 4. The room erupted into motion. Javier struggled to his feet, Amara abandoned her equipment, and Mikhail grabbed the emergency flare gun they'd been saving. "How far?" he demanded. "Maybe 2 kilometers, coming from the southeast." "I'll try to raise them," Amara said, rushing back to her station with renewed energy. Elena moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. The approaching vehicles were more visible now, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. She felt Mikhail's presence as he joined her, his breath fogging the glass beside hers. "After all this time," he murmured, "I had begun to think." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. They had all begun to think the same thing, that they would die here, one by one, as the cold and darkness claimed them. "We should signal them," Javier said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "The flare." "Not yet," Elena said, calculating distances and fuel. "Let them get closer. We have only the 2 flares left." The minutes stretched as they watched the slow approach of their potential rescuers. No one spoke. The only sound was Amara's voice in the background, repeating their call sign and coordinates into the radio with renewed urgency. When the lead snowmobile was approximately 1 kilometer away, Elena nodded to Mikhail. "Now." They moved outside together. The cold hit them again, but Elena barely noticed it now. Mikhail raised the flare gun and fired. The red streak shot upward, illuminating the station and the surrounding ice in a crimson glow that seemed almost violent after months of darkness and muted twilight. The effect was immediate. The vehicles changed course slightly, heading directly toward them. Elena felt a sob building in her chest, but forced it down. There would be time for that later. "They've seen us," Mikhail said, his voice thick with emotion despite his attempt at professional detachment. "They're coming." They stood together in the cold, watching as the distance closed. Elena became aware of Javier and Amara joining them, the 4 survivors forming a ragged line outside their damaged refuge. No one suggested going back inside to wait in warmth. After everything, they needed to witness this approach, to confirm with their own eyes that it wasn't another hallucination born of hope and desperation. As the vehicles drew near enough to distinguish details, Elena felt a fresh surge of emotion. The lead snowmobile bore the insignia of the International Arctic Research Coalition, their own organization, the one that had established this station and then lost contact with it as the communication systems failed and the winter isolation deepened. They hadn't been forgotten after all. The vehicles stopped 30 meters from the station, and figures in bright cold-weather gear dismounted. One of them, taller than the others, removed their snow goggles and hood, revealing a face Elena recognized instantly. Director Cardoso, the Brazilian administrator who had personally approved their expedition. "Dr. Petrova," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Elena stepped forward, suddenly conscious of how they must appear, gaunt, dirty, wearing patched and makeshift clothing. The survivors of a disaster rather than the scientists they had been. "We've been here," she replied simply, her voice rough from disuse. "Waiting." Cardoso and his team approached cautiously, their expressions a mixture of relief, shock, and professional assessment as they took in the condition of both the station and its inhabitants. "We received fragments of your transmissions," Cardoso explained as he reached them. "Enough to know you were alive, but not enough to establish consistent communication. The weather prevented air rescue attempts and the ice conditions." He gestured helplessly. "We tried 3 separate ground expeditions. The first 2 had to turn back." Elena nodded, processing this information against the months of silence and uncertainty they had endured. "We thought you might have given up." "Never," Cardoso said firmly, looking each of them in the eye. "We never gave up." The medical officer from the rescue team was already examining Javier, concern evident as she listened to his breathing. The technical specialists were surveying the station, their expressions growing more impressed as they recognized the extent of the jury-rigged repairs that had kept the structure partially functional. "How many?" Cardoso began, then hesitated. The station complement was 7. 4 survived, Elena said quietly. Kowalski in the first month, his heart. Takahashi during a repair attempt in the storm. Chen. She swallowed hard. Chen 3 weeks ago. The cold, the malnutrition, everything. Cardoso bowed his head briefly. "I'm sorry. We'll bring them home too." The words broke something in Elena that had been held rigid for months. She felt tears freezing on her cheeks almost as soon as they formed. Mikhail's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "We kept the station functioning," she said, needing suddenly to explain, to justify. "We maintained the research data. All the records are intact. We didn't abandon the mission." "Elena," Cardoso said gently, using her first name now, "the mission was always secondary to your lives. The rescue team worked efficiently, bringing supplies into the habitable section of the station, setting up portable heaters, examining each survivor." Elena found herself sitting on her own bed, a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a cup of hot, sweet tea in her hands. Real tea, not the pale imitation they'd been stretching for weeks. "We can transport you out tomorrow," the expedition leader was explaining. "The weather window looks good for the next 72 hours. The tracked vehicle can accommodate everyone, and we've established a forward base camp 80 kilometers south where a helicopter can reach us." Elena nodded, though the information seemed almost abstract. Tomorrow. After 87 days of not knowing if tomorrow would come, the certainty of it felt unreal. "What about the station?" Amara asked from her bed. "The research?" "A summer team will return to salvage what they can," Cardoso assured her. "Your data, your equipment, nothing will be wasted." As night fell fully, the station was warmer than it had been in months. The rescue team had brought fuel for their generators, enough to power the remaining heating systems at full capacity. The abundance of light, heat, and food created an atmosphere that felt almost surreal after their long deprivation. Unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Elena slipped away from the others and made her way to the small observation deck that had once been her favorite place in the station. It had been closed off as non-essential months ago, but tonight she needed to see the stars. The deck was cold, the heating systems not yet restored to this section, but Elena barely noticed. She stood at the reinforced glass wall and looked up at the Arctic sky, now filled with stars that had been hidden during the polar night. The familiar constellations seemed like old friends welcoming her back. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Mikhail, a blanket in his hands which he wordlessly draped around her shoulders. "You should rest," he said, his voice gentle. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Elena nodded, but made no move to leave. "I needed to see this again, to remember what it was like before." Mikhail stood beside her, his gaze following hers upward. "We are not the same people who came here," he observed. "That is perhaps as it should be." "No," Elena agreed, "we're not." They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly above the endless white landscape. Elena thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical extraction from this place, but the longer path of recovery, of reintegration into a world that had continued without them, of explaining their experiences to people who couldn't possibly understand. "I don't know if I want to go back," she admitted quietly. "Not yet. There's something pure here. Terrible, but pure." Mikhail considered this. The Arctic does not lie. It does not pretend to be other than what it is. Perhaps that is what you will miss. "And the clarity," Elena added, "knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't." "That we can take with us," he said simply. Below them, the lights of the rescue vehicles glowed against the snow, tangible proof that the world beyond still existed, that it had reached out across the ice to reclaim them. Tomorrow they would leave this place that had nearly killed them, this place that had stripped them down to their essential selves and forced them to rebuild from those bare elements. Elena made a decision then, one that felt both insignificant and profound. She would leave her journal behind, secured in the station's data vault. Not as a record for others, though it would serve that purpose too, but as a marker of the person she had been here, the person who had endured, adapted, and survived when survival seemed impossible. Whatever came next would be written on new pages. "It's time to go back," she said finally, turning from the stars toward the warmth below. Mikhail nodded, understanding that she meant more than just returning to the heated section of the station. They walked together through the darkened corridors, past the sealed doors that had once led to laboratories and living quarters, past the makeshift repairs that had held back the killing cold. As they reached the inhabited section, the sounds of human voices, more voices than they had heard in months, washed over them. Their teammates were talking with the rescuers, sharing stories, beginning the long process of reconnection with the world. Elena paused at the threshold, taking a final moment to acknowledge what was ending. Then she stepped forward into the light and warmth, ready to begin whatever came next. Day 88 since communications failure. Fuel gauge replenished. Outside temperature 44 degrees. Station temperature 19 degrees. Structural integrity irrelevant now. Communications restored. Personnel status returning.